I'm Austinlugo.
I'm Andrew Harp.
This is With Nothing to Say.
Let's talk about the Before trilogy. Take two of the Before trilogy discussion.
We're here. It's going to be great.
It's going to be
a great time. Even better. It's going to be all the better.
Way better. It's going to be shorter, maybe.
Maybe.
All right. In lieu of that, then let's get started.
But before we get started, quick shout out to the People's Review. It's a really great podcast. It's these two guys. They're funny. They're hilarious. They talk about TV, movies, comic books, all kinds of stuff, a lot of games too. The last episode they did was Total Recall. It's a really good episode, really insightful. You all should probably, give it a listen.
Yes.
All right, Andrew. Get into it.
All right. So the Before trilogy, it's a series of 3 movies directed by the man Richard Linklater. Austin, for the audience, describe what is the Before trilogy. Just describe what it is.
So the Before trilogy is in some ways Richard Linklater's original attempt at Boyhood. And it's based off of kind of very similar to stuff Francois Truffaut did in 400 Blows and the films that led after that, which is basically you have these two characters and they meet up once in 1994. They meet up again 9 years later in 2004?
2003, 2004, yeah.
Yeah, 2004. And they meet up again in 2013. And so the first film is about falling in love. The second film is about missed connections. And the final film is about love, I guess, post marriage or, love long term, more than just the immediate love, I guess.
In the last discussion, I didn't talk much about Boyhood. Of course, Boyhood was a really big deal a few years ago because it was like, oh, he filmed it over 12 years. That movie is fine. I've watched it only once. It doesn't resonate the same as the Before trilogy, in my opinion. There's something off with the writing and the acting a little bit. And the people who went crazy over that movie, it's like Linklater already did it, but he did it way better with the Before trilogy, which is a great exploration of time and love and all this stuff. But hey, I digress. Let's get into the first movie, 1995, with Before Sunrise.
So Before Sunrise starts off in a train, and there's this German couple kind of having this sort of argument. There's no translations or anything. There's no subtitles. It's just this German couple having an argument. And Celine, Julie Depley's, I don't think I ever said her name right. Is it Depley? Is it Delphi? Look it up. It's Julie something or Julia something. No, I'm not sure.
Delpy.
Okay.
Delpy or whatever, however you say French. She's French.
Julie Depley's character Celine is sitting next to this couple, and she feels weird because we all feel weird when sitting next to this sort of awkward couple. And I think this is something that Richard Linklater does really well in all the films, is he's very good at capturing the real. It feels like, even though perhaps the first film has this surreal sense of time, and that's kind of less so the more you get into the other films, but his films, all of them, feel very lived in. They feel like very real worlds. That's not necessarily to say that they're necessarily the world that we live in, right? Because movies always kind of have, they're never the real world, right? No one wants to watch just 90 minutes. Although I guess you could argue that in some ways Richard Linklater's attempt at the real world is kind of Before Sunset, but we'll get into that later. But basically, he's on a train. Julie Depley feels weird, so she goes and sits somewhere else. And of course, across from her is saying Ethan Hawke's character, Jesse, and they sort of strike up this conversation about the books they're reading. They go back and forth, a little bit flirtatious, a little fun, and they go into the dining car and they share a meal together.
Yep. Basically, each one of these movies is basically a series of conversations between Jesse and Celine. That's pretty much how the movie is. But yeah, like you said, they have a meal. They hit it off a little bit. There's some chemistry going on. And Jesse says he's got to catch a flight, or later. So they stop in Vienna, which is where he's going to catch his flight. And Celine is on her way to Paris, back to France. And he gets off, but then he gets back on and he confronts Celine and he says like, hey, this is crazy, but you should really get off with me and we should hang out for the day before I have to leave on my flight. I really like you. I like talking with you. We should hang out a little bit more. And she's like, oh, what do you mean? Da, da, da. And then he kind of tells a story about like a time traveler to kind of convince her to get off about like, in the future, when you're married and your marriage isn't going well, you're going to want to think about this moment. And she's like, okay. And they get off. And that's pretty much the rest of the movie is them basically touring the city of Vienna, hanging out, talking about a lot of different things. The movies are kind of hard to pin down because they talk, about so many different things. Like you said, the conversations feel very real. They feel like an actual conversation. But yeah, they get off and they go on their tour of Vienna.
And the first time, or like right as they get off or whatever, they're walking around and you can tell it's like kind of awkward. I did criticize this film before when I said that I thought they fall in love too quickly, and my ideas of love are kind of different than this sort of lovey-dovey, love at first sight, blah 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 kind of thing. But I will admit, the more I sort of look back on it, it does sort of grow over the night, right? It's not like the moment they meet, although I guess later they kind of talk about, kind of that love at first sight kind of thing. But it is kind of awkward at first. It does feel weird. It doesn't feel like Romeo and Juliet, right? They see each other once and they're like just gushing with love. It does feel a little awkward. It feels a little weird. And they're walking around Vienna and they meet these two guys who pitch just the greatest play of all time.
Yeah, it's like one of them's like a cow, right? One of them's plays a cow. I think they're talking about how like the movie is like about like espionage and all this shit, and that part's really funny. And throughout the movie they meet a couple different like weird characters and a couple different weird people and stuff like that. They talk to these like German dudes and they're like, oh, you should go to our play. And to kind of spoil it, they never go to the play. they don't go to the play, much to your disappointment, as you talked about yesterday.
It's so perfect. And like the whole movie, that's all I'm waiting for. Like I sit there for like 90 minutes waiting for this one moment. I just want to see the play. That's the only thing I'm there for. And they don't show the play. It would have been so good. I would have watched the whole play. The whole movie could have just taken place like at the like playhouse. I would have been okay with that. I would have watched that movie.
Yeah, definitely. That would have been great. I think the next thing they get on a trolley ride and they have another conversation. That conversation is like a 20 questions thing, right? Where they're asking each other different questions. Yeah, I think you see, asks Celine, like, what pisses you off? What really makes you mad? And she talks about a couple things. But that seems really fun. They're kind of like bouncing back these questions, real questions. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't feel like too out of the realm of the possibility.
Yeah, and kind of the big questions they ask is, of course, he asks her first sexual experience, and her being very French, she's just like super open about it. She's like, oh yeah, I met this guy at like, I don't know, a camp or something. She was, I don't remember the exact story, but she met someone, blah, blah, blah. And then of course her question to him is, have you ever been in love before? And unlike her, even though on a surface level, talking about sex, especially, I guess that's a very American thing, right? We're very comfortable talking about sex, but we're not very comfortable talking about love. So when she asks him about love, he kind of tightens up. He's like, oh, I don't really want to talk about it. He just kind of pushes back against it in a very, I don't want to say American, because like, right, you watch rom-coms and that's a very American, I mean, obviously rom-coms aren't just an American thing, but in many ways I would say the rom-com was invented by and for Americans. There's something very Americanized about the way Americans see love and how the rom-com kind of functions in that way. And I don't think I would consider any of these movies rom-coms by any sense. They are romance movies, as we kind of talked about. Like there's like romance elements.
They're pretty funny. I find them very funny.
Yeah, but it's not like it's not like When Harry Met Sally, or it's not like, I don't know, His Girl Friday, or right. It doesn't like fit into like the traditional what a rom-com movie does or is. And I think that's partly just because the way Richard Linklater sees love and his interest in love is very different than just two people meet, they fall in love, right, and then happily ever after. That's not what any of these movies are about. And I think that's a bold thing to do. And I think that's certainly a risky move, especially, if you're a filmmaker, even though, of course, first and foremost, you're an artist and, blah, blah, blah. But it is also your job. So you do want it to make money. So to go and make a film that although other three movies, I guess this has the tightest ending in the sense like it's the most structured, as we kind of talked before. It's structured of the three films, but it's still kind of like, it's not really a happy ending. It's not a sad ending, but it's not really a happy ending either. It's just kind of, it just is what it is.
Yeah, and I also think that Linklater, of course, is very interested. He's interested in love, but he's also very interested in time, and he's interested in how kind of time affects, like, I guess, love or relationships and things like that, which of course once again goes into kind of like, the greatness of these three movies. But yeah, I totally agree. I think that the next part of the movie is, they're walking around a lot, they're having conversations. And I think the big moment, the next big event is, and I could be wrong, is when they're on the Ferris wheel, or is there something that happens before that? I'm trying to remember.
There's a graveyard. You did this last time. You gotta talk about the graveyard.
You talk about the graveyard again. Do it.
So now that I think about the graveyard now, which I didn't talk about before, there's a lot of references in all three movies to a lot of James Joyce's work, especially Ulysses, but his other stuff too. If you've read Dubliners, or I haven't read Finnegan's Wake, but there's something else you
actually, it's actually funny you say that too. Like, I believe Before Sunrise, doesn't it take place on Bloomsday?
Yeah, it takes place at the exact same time when Ulysses takes place. I mean, obviously, other than that, they're pretty different, but I guess in essence, they're the same. And at the graveyard, Celine says, "Oh, when I was 13 years old, my class went on a visit here for some reason, and we visited this graveyard." I don't know what kind of class that would be, but they went to see a graveyard. And this graveyard is full of people who had washed up on shore. So they're all people who have most likely either, fallen off boats or committed suicide. How do you make connections with these people who you've met, you don't know, or you don't know their lives, you don't know their families, and then you have to bury them. You only see them in their death. You never see them in life. And to Celine, of all the gravestones, the one that touched her the most was one of a 13-year-old girl, because that 13-year-old girl was the same age, of course, as Celine was when she saw the gravestone. And so it's the first time in her life that she recognizes that life is finite, that, they're not very religious people in any sense. They're not, Christian or Hindu or Buddhist or anything like that. Neither of them really believe in much of an afterlife. To them, their time is pretty finite. They talk about that a lot in the film. In all the films, they talk a lot about time and death, especially, I would say, with each film, they're more and more interested in death because, when you're 23 years old, you're not really that interested in death because super long time from now, probably, hopefully. But when you're in your 40s, it's a different conversation. But it is one of the first times they kind of bring up death and this idea of, what does it mean to be alive and what does it mean to die? And it kind of brings them closer together in the sense that time is finite, and this is sort of just like a moment in time, and just living in that moment is what's most important more than anything else.
That's why they're awesome. Going from there, the next big moment is, of course, on the Ferris wheel, where they kiss, which once they kiss, I think that's kind of when it is sunset, right? So they kiss on a big Ferris wheel, and then they kind of start to feel a romantic connection, They go to a festival, right? Like a fair.
Or something.
Yeah, and they're like hanging out, having fun. They're talking more openly with each other. And of course, once again, they talk about all kinds of different things. Like you said, love, life, religion, death, the big ones. And they go to a couple bars, a couple different clubs. Probably the biggest one, right, is when they go to the bar and they play like pinball, right? And there's like a show there. It's like a guy doing like an Eddie Vedder, Kurt Cobain impression or something like that. I don't want to like besmirch the guy playing guitar in the club at the time, but he's like doing like he sounds like Kurt Cobain or Eddie Vedder or something like that, like really kind of dating the movie. Like, oh yeah, definitely it's the 90s, right? But they mostly talk about relationships while they're playing pinball. I like that conversation a lot because they reveal some things that are interesting, Celine first says that she broke up with her boyfriend 6 months ago, which, that relationship didn't work out. And I think she talks about she was putting in too much effort and he wasn't putting in enough. And Jesse reveals in the conversation that he had gone to Europe to spend time with his girlfriend who was studying in Madrid. But when he arrived, I think he says something like, she did all she could to be sure that they weren't alone, right? So she has like all these new friends and stuff. And he's like, okay, and then they break up. So he's like, he found a cheap flight home through Vienna, and so he decided to travel across Europe by train. that's kind of like the first part of talking about relationships. There's like one part in that conversation where Jesse talks about like getting broken up, which is like very hard hitting. I love that moment where he talks about breaking up. It's really hard. He talks about like, when you're broken up, it makes you think about when you broke up with someone, because it makes you think about how little you cared about that person or something like that. I was like, whoa, that's like very, very like, the writing's great. And to kind of talk a little bit about it too, each one of these movies, of course, are collaboration between Richard Linklater and Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy, where they, for each of these movies, they get together and they write the script. I think like what Linklater does is that he brings a script to them, and then they all work it out and they rehearse it and they talk about it and they kind of go from there. I think for Before Sunrise, they shacked up together for 3 weeks just to like kind of, mull over the script and make changes and rewrite it and stuff like that. So, and it definitely shows. I mean, it's, phenomenal, but I digress.
And of course, even though in the first one, neither Hawk or Delpy are given writer's credits, they are given writer's credits in the second two, because they do play a really big role. And even though it does feel very informal or conversational or sort of almost improvised, it's very like structured. It's very like they went over and over and over again, kind of as you were saying. And it's really impressive. They feel, especially when you watch the second one and third one, they feel like very lived in characters. They feel like very real characters. They never feel like characters that are made for movies. They're never really interested in perfect characters, which is a risky thing to do, to not make characters that aren't necessarily likable, because these characters aren't, it's not that they're bad people, right? Because we like bad people as much as we like good people, right? If they're like pure evil or pure good, right? Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker, everyone loves, to hate Darth Vader or love Luke Skywalker, right? We love the just good and evil. But with Richard Linklater's characters, at least in these movies, they're very complex, and they're not characters who are trying to be liked because they're characters in the movies. They just feel like characters who are just being themselves. And if you like them, that's fine. And if you don't like them, that's okay too, because that's just who they are, right? They're just being what they are, I guess.
Absolutely. I think the next scene is the canal poem scene, right?
There's that fortune teller scene.
Actually, can you talk about that?
So they're sitting outside of another bar, Celine and Jesse, and across the way they see like this couple getting their palm read by this fortune teller. And you can tell that Jesse's like, oh, she's just like some scam artist, right? She doesn't believe in these things. Like, I don't care about that, right? It's just a way for her to get money. And of course, even though it doesn't seem like Celine's like, really into astrology or like, palm reading or anything like that, she's trying to be a little more optimistic about the situation. And it's always interesting to talk about fortune tellers in movies, because they play a really weird role in films, because they are characters written for a film. Because in a way, right, a director or a writer, they are sort of fortune tellers. They are sort of playing God in a certain sense. And so fortune tellers are often a way for directors or writers or filmmakers to express certain things that are hard to get across in other ways. A lot of movies that's used as kind of exposition, because sometimes you just kind of get exposition across. That's not really what's used in this film. I think what's interesting about this film is what the fortune teller says feels pretty much exactly what a fortune teller would say, which is it's pretty vague and it doesn't really like mean a whole lot. The character kind of, and I think this is something Richard Linklater is interested in, is taking these expectations you have of what a film should be and then kind of just turning them just like a little bit to the side, right? He's not like flipping all of your expectations, but it is just kind of like poking right at these expectations. And expectation is the fortune teller is supposed to go over there and say, oh, you're two people, you're in love, and blah 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 blah. But that's not really what she says. I mean, she doesn't not say that, but it's so like vague and just kind of out there. It doesn't really, right? It doesn't have that sort of hit you think it would. And I think that's weird and interesting.
Yeah, and after that, you get a similar scene then with the canal. They're walking by a canal, and they're approached by like a destitute poet. And he's like, if you give me a word, I can write you a poem. And if you like it, you can give me money. And they're like, okay. And they give him the word milkshake, and he kind of writes this pretty good poem called Illusion Angel. And they're like, oh, thanks, here's some money, da da da. And they walk away. And once again, like Jesse, of course, is like very, very cynical, where he's like, he probably just wrote that already and just inserted the word in there. It's probably the same poem every single time, which, I guess it's the only time in the movie where Celine and Jesse have any kind of like argument. They don't really argue. And that kind of like is kind of like a continuation, like you said, of like some of the themes and in the fortune teller scene for sure. And then you get to they're like in a cafe, and they do, of course, the great classic. We talked about this yesterday, of course, the classic, fake phone call thing where Celine pretends to call her friend that she's supposed to meet to let her know she's not going to be able to come. But the person that she's talking to is, of course, Jessie acting like her friend. And then they do the switch as well, which is great. And like I said yesterday, I believe Julie Delpy said that actually happened to her. And it's kind of like a fun little way to kind of reveal certain things about their characters in an interesting way and like a really fun way. Like it's like, I don't know, like a scene like that is just kind of hard to like not like enjoy. Like it's just very, very enjoyable for me. And I think like Celine reveals that she was ready to get off the train right away. Like she liked him right away. And Jesse reveals that even though he bought a flight, he didn't really buy a flight that was not cheaper. He just really just wanted to escape. It wasn't the money aspect. It was just kind of like, I just want to travel in Europe for a little while kind of thing. And you can tell that they're really connecting, at least their characters are, and it's just a very kind of almost touching scene. And I'm trying to think what happens after that, right? I'm trying to think what happens after the phone conversation. Well, of course, they get wine, right?
They go to the boat first. Before we get to the boat scene, there's something that I find interesting about this film that's different from the other two, which is even though in all three films, these feel like very lived-in characters, they feel like very real characters. In this film, like everything exists in Vienna, right? They rarely ever talk about their lives outside of Vienna. And this isn't like any way like to say this is like badly written or wrong. I think this is clearly intentional. But these people feel like people who only live in the moment. Like you don't know what really either of them do. I guess you know that Celine is a student, but you don't really know what Jesse does. You don't really know where Jesse lives. You don't know really anything about them.
Yeah.
And the few reveals you do get are just kind of like side things to sort of not even to keep moving the plot along, but just kind of things that just kind of slip out, right? Like they both have a friend who's like this or that. I think that's a really interesting thing that has a lot to do with because these films, as much as they are about love and each other, I think what a lot of these films are about is being of that age. And so it's kind of a study of being a 25-year-old and the way you exist in the world. And I don't think it's necessarily a selfish way of being in the world. It's just the priorities that we have are very different than the priorities of someone in their 30s is very different from the priorities of someone in their 40s. And I think he's really interested in, as much as anything else, is what it's like to kind of live at that moment. And of course, both these people are in their 20s and they're written by 20-something year olds. So of course it feels real. But I think of like most movies about teenagers, like any movie that takes place in a high school, which I guess most of the time they aren't even teenagers anyways. I don't remember high school ever being like that. I mean, maybe that's just my high school experience. But they never, right? Yeah.
Well, to kind of go off just a little bit, that's semi-related, is that one of the other things I love about this movie is that it's sort of dreamlike, but not totally dreamlike, I would say. Like I said yesterday, Celine and Jesse are like on the train, you know what I mean? And they're kind of waiting to get from station to station, and that's pretty much what they're doing right now in that moment. But then they decide to come out of the moment. And the second that they come out of the moment and get off the train and decide to just kind of like walk around and do nothing, they kind of like are living in the moment, and they kind of enter almost into like this different world. Like you said, they kind of enter into kind of almost like this dreamy kind of quality where like time doesn't seem to function, because they're not really like waiting on anything in particular. I mean, they're kind of waiting, but at the same time, like they're not sitting down and waiting to get to a station. They're waiting for the next day, but I mean, they have a whole day to do basically nothing, which is why I really enjoy that movie. I think it has kind of like that interesting quality to it that kind of makes the movie really work and make it very unique too.
I agree. And so the next scene is the boat scene. And what I remember from the boat scene is the two are sitting and they're talking about, this is kind of the first time that they have any conversation that's about the future. As you said, this movie does feel sort of dreamlike. It feels very of the moment. They're just living moment to moment. They're not really worried about responsibilities of the outside world. Everything just exists in this sort of moment. But on the boat is the first time they kind of recognize that, hey, eventually this night's going to come to an end. And they kind of have a discussion, what do we do when this night ends? And they're like, well, I don't want to exchange phone numbers. I want to write letters. Like that just feels trite, I guess. Like they're afraid that they'll exchange numbers or letters and then they'll just kind of fade off, which I guess makes sense because Jesse literally just got out of a long distance relationship. So
Yeah.
I guess it makes sense they wouldn't want to do that again. It is a silly thing, I guess, in a certain sense, but it makes sense for the moment. And they do kind of they talk about it a little bit in the second one too, and the sort of not absurdity, but I guess like right there, like, oh, we were just so young and naive. And then of course the other conversation they have on the boat is about saying goodbye. And they were like, oh, I don't really like saying goodbyes. Like it's all like, cheesy and mushy and that. They're like, let's just do it now, right? Let's just get it over with.
Yeah, and after that, they go to a bar, and Jesse is able to convince the guy to give him a bottle of wine, and so that he can pay him later. Then they go to a park, and they talk about having sex. Celine says, I don't know if I want to have sex, just because like I'll miss you too much. And they kind of talk about that for a little while, but I think they do end up having sex. And then, yeah, it's the next day, and then it's time, you get to the final scene to kind of speed up a little bit, the train scene where they are saying bye to each other. And they basically right there decide like, what, no, I actually do want to see you again. I like you a lot. I have to see you again. And they're like, okay, maybe we could exchange, phone numbers or something like that. And they decide like, no, we're not going to do that. That sucks. How about we go to the same place, the same station in 6 months? And they're like, okay, let's do that. They say bye. And then that's the end of the movie.
And she gets on a train and she leaves. That's it.
Cut to 9 years later, Before Sunset, the second movie of the Before trilogy. My personal favorite. Well, actually, we have to wrap up before sunrise. Austin, wrap it up. Final thought, real quick.
So, even though we talked about this yesterday, perhaps because we've talked about this film 2 days in a row, and I've had a little bit more time to sort of sit on it and think on it, I think I am going to change my original score. My original score was a 5 out of 10 because I had some serious problems with two people just walking around talking. But the more I think about it, and maybe it's just like it's one of those films that like I like more as, like having seen it than the actual experience of watching it, which isn't to say it's a bad film. It's just like, that's just kind of how some films are. So I think I'm going to come back with a 7 out of 10. My original score was a 5, but I think it really is worth a 7. I think there really is a lot there, especially in the context of the trilogy. I think if this was just a one-off film, I would stick with my original 5 out of 10 score. But because of the way it fits into the trilogy, and there's some interesting parallels that we'll get into when we talk about Before Midnight that kind of parallel this film, I think are really intriguing to me that I didn't really consider upon talking about it yesterday, but I will get into later. But better than yesterday. So
it's beautiful, it's funny, it's touching, it's kind of dreamy, but not in a weird way, in a good way. Yeah, I love it so much. It's just it's just kind of like a fun movie to watch and kind of like live vicariously through it. You know what I mean? It just kind of has that quality to it, I think. And yeah, I love it. 9 out of 10 for sure. But yeah, once again, second movie, Before Sunset, 2004. It's been 9 years since the last movie. Jesse, he's in Paris, France. He's at a book signing, and he's being interviewed by a few reporters. He wrote a book, like a novel, and it appears to be getting traction. It's clear throughout the movie, and kind of at the beginning as well, that he wrote the book about Before Sunrise. It's the novelization of Before Sunrise. You have these reporters who are asking him all these different questions about the book. They kind of poke and prod at him. One woman kind of asked him, oh, did that night really happen? Did that actually happen to you? And he's kind of like gives up. He's like, yeah, that did happen to me, and And then she also asked him, I think you said this yesterday, like, oh, did you meet 6 months after? Like, they meet? And he's like, you know what? No, I'm not going to determine if that actually did happen. That's really up to the reader to decide themselves. And, he kind of talks to the three reporters and he's like, you think it did happen. They did meet. You think they did not meet and you're not 100% sure. And I think Richard Linklater is obviously interested in endings or movies or books or whatever that kind of are ambiguous. It's not really about whether or not they saw each other or not. But in this context, it's clear that Jesse did not see Celine because Celine shows up at the bookstore and he's very surprised to see her. They say, hey, how's it going? And they decide to kind of hang out for a little bit. Jesse has to take a plane in an hour, but he's like, you know what? No, it's fine. We can hang out for a minute and talk, and catch up and stuff. And that's basically what they do. They walk around Paris, France. They go to a couple different locations. 80 minutes long, extremely efficient. There's basically no other characters, and it's just them talking, and that's it.
I sometimes wonder, going back to kind of that first scene at the shop, and you kind of have the reporters asking questions, especially when they ask questions about what happens at the end or what happens next. I'm always fascinated by the world of like these extended universes, like Marvel or DCEU or the other ones, because like people will spend their lives asking questions about things that aren't in the movies. And then like it happened, I remember like after Zack Snyder or after the original Justice League was released back in like 2017, like for like 5 years, people just harassed Zack Snyder just endlessly with like all of these questions, just constantly. Like that was just all they did all of the time. And even after he released the Zack Snyder version, they still have like all these questions about things that aren't in the movie. And just this idea of being interested in things that like not only aren't real, right? It is just like never existed and never will exist, to like be so invested in something. And then for directors to feel, and you can tell like when most directors talk about it, like even if you talk to like the Russo brothers, even when they directed Infinity War and Endgame and a couple other Marvel movies, like after a while you can tell that they get kind of like tired of it, because like eventually they're not really directors anymore, they're just people who answer questions about things that don't exist.
Yeah. I feel like most successful directors, as soon as they're done finishing a movie, they're probably thinking about the next movie. They're probably not thinking about any plot holes or inconsistencies with their last movie because it's already finished and over with. If you ask them a question about their new movie, they would probably answer you and probably be very happy to talk to you about it. But yeah, I do think that's a very funny and very true.
So the first big scene the two have is at the cafe
Well,
where
before that, it's my favorite moment. Before that is when they're walking,
oh yes,
and
that's right,
Celine
you
is
tell that story.
and Celine is like, "Oh, were you there at the train station? I have to know." Because she was like, "Yeah, I wasn't there because my grandma died. Like suddenly, I attended the funeral that day, so I just couldn't go." And Jesse's like, "Yeah, I didn't go either." And she's like, "Oh, okay." But then she's like, "Wait a minute. Why were you not there? What was your excuse for not being there? We said we were gonna meet." And I love like Ethan Hawke, Julie Delpy. Like I said yesterday, they're at the fucking top of their game, dude. The acting in this movie is just the best ever. They're amazing. They hit everything. They're amazing. Like Ethan Hawke has like a smirk on his face, and then it's obvious that like he was actually there. He was just clowning, which I don't know. I really like that moment. It's very very funny. It's just very telling. And they talk a little bit about the meeting, and it's like it's not a big deal. Da 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 da. And then the next big scene is when they actually do go to a cafe and they drink a little bit, and yeah.
I think it's interesting how Ethan Hawke's character Jesse, or I guess how Ethan Hawke sort of plays that moment, because for him, I mean, it's kind of a sad moment, because as he points out, for her it's only like a train ride, right? It's like an hour or two away. For him, he has to fly to another country, a long ass flight, get to borrow money from his dad, and then to go there and just not see her. And as you said, they are kind of at their top of the game, because he plays in a way where like you can tell that like it still kind of stings a bit, like even though it was 9 years ago. Yeah. But like there's still like something there that's like, because of course it would. I mean, just imagine, right? Flying across the country to meet this woman you met one time who you fell deeply in love with, and then it's just a missed connection. I mean, he does it really well.
It really does feel like two friends like meeting each other after not talking for years. Like it's just so convincing. I'm trying to think what they talk about at the cafe though. Do you remember?
Yeah. Well, the only thing I remember from the cafe is Celine tells the story about the two cops that come to her house when she lived in New York City.
Well, yeah, I think before that and during that, they of course talk about like their different careers and the things that they've done. Of course, Jesse, he talks about writing books and doing this book tour thing. And Celine kind of talks about how she's kind of like working in environmental affairs, working with nonprofit organizations to work on the environment and stuff like that. And she kind of talks about politics and things like that as well. And they talk about how like, Jesse lives in New York currently and he teaches at NYU or studied at NYU. And Celine talks about how like at around the same time, she was also in New York City. So they talk a little bit about how kind of weird that is that they were in New York at the same time. And yeah, she tells a really great story, very, very good story.
And the story is she's living in New York City. She calls the cops and they come up to the apartment and she's like, blah, blah, blah. And woman officer goes downstairs to like just go to the car or something. And the male police officer takes his gun like out of his holster, idolizing the gun in this very prototypical masculine American, just like, got a gun, you got to get a gun, everyone's got to get a gun. And then the next day she applies for a gun, even though she's never held a gun before or touched a gun. And she realizes at that moment that, what would she do with a gun? Why does she need a gun? And so she moves back to France, like within like the next year or something.
Yep. That's kind of like some of the big things that they talk about. They talk more about like careers than they do in the first movie, which I find interesting because it's a big part of their lives now. I'm trying to think what else they talk about, or like I said, it's basically just them walking around Paris, and that's pretty much it. You know, there's not really any set pieces. They go into a couple different places, but that's pretty much it.
Is this the movie where they go into that church, or is that in the third one?
That's in the third movie.
Okay.
Yeah, so they really don't go into anything at all, which is totally fine, just because like I think, like I said yesterday, for me, I love the second movie because, you know, they touch on so many different subjects and ideas, and the script almost, like the dialogue itself almost functions like as if it's the plot of just like any other movie that has several different locations and stuff like that. Kind of almost has like the trajectory and kind of a form of what you would expect from a typical movie, with the different reveals, and the performances are really great too. And, you know, like I said, it kind of comes into what I was talking about too, where they express even way more emotions. They're angry, they're sad, and that just comes through full force. It's just very, very, for me, it's very, very convincing. And I find it a much more passionate movie because there's so many more emotions at stake, and there's so much more at stake. And that's definitely one of the reasons why I love the movie so much. It just feels way more pressing and way more emotional. It's fucking great. I just love it so much. And I think also they talk a little bit about their relationships too.
Yeah, their relationships are clearly not, at least their relationships with their significant others are not healthy or like loving relationships in a traditional sense. He is married to a woman who, on his wedding day, the only thing he could think about was Celine, which isn't, you know, a great thing to think about on your wedding day. He's not really in love with her, and pretty much the only reason they got married is because they have a son, or she was pregnant at the time with their son, Hank. And then, of course, Celine has a boyfriend who is this photojournalist, and her favorite thing about her boyfriend is that he is never there. Like, that's her favorite thing, is that she doesn't have to see him.
It's clear that they're both dissatisfied with their relationships at the moment. Jesse loves his son, but, you know, they're just not gelling with their respective significant others. And then I think at one point they go on a boat. They go on like a touristy boat on the canal. Jesse basically kind of almost confesses where he's like, you know, I think the reason why I wrote that book is to meet you. I really wanted to see you again. I was desperate to see you that I decided to write a book. And that's kind of interesting, you know. I think Linklater himself said that idea in itself he found very, very interesting, and I think it plays well with the movie. It is very, you know, you don't have email, you don't have social media. Well, I guess you do have email, never mind, but you still don't like really know, like they don't know each other that well, right? Like to be able to like, you know, so that might have been the way to do it. You know, nowadays you can just go on Facebook and be like, oh, look, I found my Parisian lover that I met in you know,
a very short movie,
85 or something like that. They're just on Facebook. But yeah, I find that very interesting. And by the way, throughout the whole movie too, you know, Celine's like, oh, don't you have a flight to catch? And he's like, no, we can like, keep going. We can keep talking. It's okay. Don't worry about it. It's clear that their old feelings are being rekindled as well. I forgot talking about this yesterday. Before they talk about their families and like the relationships that they're in currently, right before that, they talk about like the time they did have sex, you know what I mean? So that's kind of like a really tough transition in the conversation. It's very good.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that both in this movie and in the movie before is they kindle a relationship or like kind of right talk about each other before either of them talks about any possible significant other. I mean, obviously in the first movie it's not as big a deal because both of them have been like broken up from their partner. But in this one, I mean, one of them's married and one of them is a serious boyfriend. And the fact that before he talks about his son, before he talks about his wife, or before she talks about her partner, they talk about the last time they met and had sex, which is just interesting.
I forgot too, Celine also at one point like feigns forgiveness. So like he mentioned something about their night, and he's like, oh, what do you mean? She's like, oh, I forgot. And Jesse's kind of like, what, really? Like that, I remember everything about that night. That was one of the greatest nights of my life. And she's like, oh, I forgot. Sorry. And then after the boat ride, they get on the van, and she kind of becomes extremely emotional, and she's like, like things have, since I read your book, I'm been really mad. I've been pissed off because it just now feels like everything's over, like the world is ending. And she's like, of course I remember everything from that night. Like I was totally kidding. Like of course I remember. And they're in the van because they're dropping off Celine at her apartment, which the apartment, of course, is the final part and the final scene of the movie.
One of the things that I love about the van, which I think it is
Great scene.
an incredible scene, and it's one of my favorite. It's probably one of my favorite scenes in the entire trilogy.
I would say it's like the climax of the movie.
It really, yeah, it's really the first big conflict they've had in the whole trilogy, because there's not really any conflict in the first one. I mean, there's like a little like scuffle, but like there's no like real fight. But like this one is like, it's a pretty intense fight where like you can see both sides and you're like, oh shit, like you can see like they both fucked up. And like part of the fight is this whole idea of what is your responsibility as an artist? What is your responsibility when you're telling a story? Like, is it okay to include details? Because I mean, basically he told this very intimate thing, right? Something that she found very personal. I mean, to her, right? That was her story. And in a way, I can see where her perspective, it feels stolen, right? Even though, he had it too, right? It was supposed to be their thing. And the fact that he's sort of profiting off it, I can understand this sort of almost feeling weird about it. And that becomes more central in the third film than this film. But there is this sort of idea of, as an artist, what liberties can you take when you have to make a separation between, the real world and the fake world? I didn't talk about this yesterday, but I kind of think of that HBO show How To with John Wilson. And there's that episode, I think it's the episode about his cat that scratches the chair. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And to the interior designer. And the interior designer like points out of like how he always uses the camera sort of hide from the world, like how he uses film to sort of, not exist in the world. It's kind of like that in this, where he's using the book, and obviously part of it, write the book, is his idea that, oh, well, maybe he'll like write the book and then they'll meet again.
Yeah.
But the other part is it's him hiding away from the world. It's him not having to face the reality that she's gone, right? He even talks about how he wrote an ending, or supposedly wrote an ending to the book, where they do actually meet 6 months later, and they have like, this very sexual relationship.
Yeah.
But it's just kind of, I understand where she's coming from, where it's kind of him living in this fantasy. And again, in the third one, as we'll talk about later, you can tell that there are things that he sort of shapes himself as the hero of the story. So he gives himself all the best parts of himself without looking into like the darker, more shitty parts of himself. And he does the same thing with Celine. But the problem is, and especially in the third one, is if you make them a perfect person in the book, they're not that person in the real world, right? And she's pissed, right? She's pissed by that. She's pissed by this idea that you've paid me to be this person. I'm not this person.
Yeah.
And what's great about the scene taking place in a moving car, they can't go anywhere, right? They're trapped in this space together. If this argument happened just like on a street or like in a cafe, like one of them could just walk up and leave. But if you're in a moving vehicle, you can't go anywhere, and it just feels so like claustrophobic and constrained, and it's great. It's a really great scene.
Outstanding. And yeah, they cool off, and then they get to her apartment. They go up into it. I'm remembering that like it takes forever to go up the stairs. I don't know, like it's filmed, like it feels very long and drawn out. And they get to the apartment and they're hanging out, and Jesse's like, I want you to play me a song, because earlier Celine talks about, like, oh, I like playing guitar, I like writing songs. And he's like, okay, play me a song. And she's like, okay. She's persuaded. She plays a song. It's like a waltz, which is about, of course, their earlier encounter, and Jesse's like, oh, da, 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 da. Yeah, they're just kind of hanging out. And of course, like, oh, you're going to miss your flight. Da, da, da. He puts in like a Nina Simone CD, and Celine kind of then like begins to kind of dance to the song just in time. Great song. And she like imitates Simone and kind of like talks about seeing her live and stuff like that. And she says, hey, you're going to miss that plane. You're going to miss your flight. And Jesse's like, yeah, I know. It's one of the best endings of any movie ever, at least in this kind of genre, right? Like, it's just a great ending. Before Sunrise is like a movie about like being in the moment or whatever you want to call it. And then in this movie, it's kind of like they meet and they're like not in the moment at all, right? Like their lives are completely like, I wouldn't say in disarray, but they're, they're careerist and, all this stuff. And in that moment, And the single moment at the end of the movie, Jesse at least decides to completely act out of the moment, completely be in the moment, and completely submit himself to what he really wants. And also, it's a movie about how like a moment can really like completely change your life, like a snap moment. And in this movie, once again, the ending also kind of serves as kind of like this idea that like at any moment, whether it's your decision or not, like your life could completely change in an instant. Life is mostly boring. Things happen slowly, but events do happen in a very dramatic way, and this movie does it really well in kind of a very well done way. It's great.
The ending still surprises me. Like, still looking back on it, I don't even think surprised the right word. I think I'm almost like baffled by the end in a certain sense. That's not to say like it doesn't work or it's not exactly how that film should end. But it's kind of as I was saying yesterday, it feels like this film, much more than the last film, it feels like we are watching these characters. Like the viewer feels like someone who's kind of there, kind of watching along.
Yeah.
And at this point, it's kind of like it's time for the viewer to go. Like this isn't your story. Like you just have to like leave. Like it feels of the trilogy, it feels least like a movie in the sense that it's not like a traditional like this happens and this happens and that happens. Like obviously all three movies they cater to an audience. That's what movies do, right? They cater to the viewer. But this one of the three is like the least like that. Like it's least interested in the viewer in a certain sense, I guess. And that ending is just so jarring. I remember sitting there and movie ending, and I legitimately paused it and like went back to make sure I didn't miss something. I thought like I skipped a scene or like I hit a button and like I missed something. It didn't. It's just over. It just ends. And it's just jarring and it works. It really, as you said, it really works.
Awesome. Final thoughts. Let's go.
I like this film. I have a lot of respect for this film. One of the things I like about this film a lot is it does kind of sort of build up tension in a sense and sort of like their conflict, and it kind of gets more and more intense. And when you get that climactic moment in this film, which I would argue there really isn't much of a climax in the last film, it feels very deserved, right? It doesn't feel like a climax that they kind of just wrote in, at the last minute, or like, oh, we have to have a climax, so let's put a scene right before it, right? So then we just have it there. Like it feels like the whole film really builds up to that moment inside the car. And as we talked about before, these characters just feel so lived in. They just feel so real. It really is Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy just absolutely crushing. I mean, just absolutely amazing. But I think my only problem with this film is the fact that not a whole lot happens, which is, I guess, my problem with Before Sunrise 2. It is just two people, walking around a city. I mean, visually it's fine, but it feels like there's no risks taken visually. Like it's just, a guy and a camera just walking around, which is fine, right? A film does, I'm not saying a film has to be anything more than that, but I think it could be a better film if it was willing to express their emotions, not only right through their language. So I'm going to give this film a 7 out of 10. I still think it's a very enjoyable film. It's a very good film. I just think there could be more cinema.
I just don't know if I feel the same way about it. There's nothing I would really change about it. If you're making a movie and you have a story you want to tell the story the best way you can. And sometimes it means you kind of getting out of the way, right? And kind of has to let the actors kind of do their thing. So, but I see what you mean. Yeah, there isn't a lot of finesse. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't change anything about it. I just think like, when it comes down to like telling a story and the conversations and the things that they talk about, it's very, very convincing and amazing. And yeah, you got to give it the 10 because it's just, like I said, I wouldn't change anything about it. Final one before midnight, 2013 begins. Jesse, he's at an airport. He's dropping his son off.
I love the opening scene of this film. And as I kind of talked about yesterday, for some weird reason, and maybe I guess part of it is just because of the reason that I can connect with the character of Hank as much as I can with the parents, but I connected with this film more than I connected with the other two. Maybe it's just because of where I am with Emily and my relationship is much more similar to where, I mean, not the bad parts, but the good parts of where Celine and Jesse are in a relationship, which they've been in a relationship a long time together. But this opening scene is at the airport, which is sort of this pretty intense way to start the film. I mean, it doesn't feel like I think something that Richard Linklater does really well is it never feels melodramatic. It never feels saccharine in any way. Like it doesn't feel like forced in any way. It genuinely feels like it's a kid whose dad lives 10,000 miles away from him, and he only gets to see him in the summer. And Jesse's like, oh, I'm gonna make it to your recital this year. And Jesse's like, please don't come. Like, I love you, Dad, but whenever you and mom are together, like it's just miserable. And being the kid of divorced parents whose parents have been divorced since I was little, like yeah, that's how it is. I mean, I know there's plenty of parents who are very affable after they get divorced, but my parents never were. I mean, still aren't. Like you put them in the same room and they are not two happy people together. And it's true that whenever you have those sort of events as a kid, you dread those moments when they are together because through no fault of their own. Like it's not because these people are bad people, but because they have the history that they have, it's hard for them to see outside of that. And so as the kid, you often feel this sort of weird responsibility. And that's how Jesse feels in that moment. And I've certainly, had those sort of experiences where you feel sort of, even though of course it's not your fault. I talked to my mother-in-law about this a lot because her parents have been divorced like most of her life, which is like I never understood kids who are like who try to parent trap or like wish their parents to get back together. Like I never understood that because that sounds miserable. Like I know my parents and they do not get along, and always that sort of idea sort of baffled me. And Jesse's kind of in the same boat, right? It's like he loves both of his parents. He thinks they're great people, but he knows that they don't belong together. And so to kind of live in that experience with him is just very real and very raw. And I really felt that on both ends, right? I felt that both as being a kid again, even though I'm not a dad, I feel that sort of wanting to do it whatever you can to be the best you can be, but not being able to do that. It's intense.
Yeah, he drops him off, go to Chicago with his mom, like you said. And then it's revealed basically right away, for the most part, that they've been together for a while. They have two twin girls, and they were invited to stay at the Southern Peloponnese by a famous author to like hang out like for the summer and vacation with them at their like really nice place there. And they're driving back and from the airport back to the author's place, which I think that the car ride is maybe my favorite part of the movie. It's very well done. Once again, it's just a full conversation between the two of them. I think maybe like one or two cuts are in there, but it's completely just single cuts of them driving. And they talk a lot about different things, and they get a lot of updates, including the fact that Celine, she's frustrated with her job. That's kind of how the conversation starts, is that like she has like this project she was trying to get off the ground and it fell through, and she talks about really wanting to do this take this new job in government, and Jesse's like, I don't know if you want that job, are you sure? And she's like, yeah, no, I do. And they kind of talk a little bit about that, and once again, they're both very convincing. They really do seem like two lived in aged parents, and they just come across as extremely genuine. I just love that car conversation. It's so good all the way through. It's just super interesting. They talk about a lot of different things.
One of the things I like about the car conversation is they do this thing that I've only seen in like people who have been together for a long time. And it's something Emily and I do a lot, which is when you've been with someone for like so many years, I mean, at least for me, right, more than half my life, you kind of know them as well or probably better than you know yourself.
Yep.
And so when Jesse's arguing about her not taking the new job, it's not that, hey, I don't want you to take the new job. I don't want you, right, to do this thing. It's, you don't like him. You don't like this. You don't like that. And it's the way that they talk is very, maybe it's just similar to the way Emily and I talk. Like when we talk about each other's problems, but we're not talking about, hey, I mean, even though in a certain sense you're always right, there's always sort of the I implied in there. But what you're talking about is like, hey, I know you don't like this. I know you don't like that. So you shouldn't do that. And that's kind of how they have that conversation. And the way that it builds also is brilliant, because that car scene is probably like 15, 20 minutes long. It's a pretty long scene. Maybe it's not that long. I don't know. But like at the beginning, it's like very chill, and it just builds up so slowly and just builds and it builds and it builds and it builds. And it's incredible. You're right. It's just incredible.
Yeah, and I think like the big moment is when basically Jesse talks a little bit about how he's frustrated that he's unable to hang out with Hank as much and be there as his dad. He's now a teenager now, and he just feels kind of like left out, like he's not going to be able to be there as his father as much as he should. And then, yeah, like we talked about yesterday, Celine is just like, oh yeah, this is how it ends, because they kind of argue about like what they should do, because they live in Paris and they work in Paris and all that. But Hank, he's basically stuck in the United States with his mom, and so he can't really go anywhere right now. So yeah, Jesse's just kind of like frustrated, and they kind of touch on that and they talk about it a lot more later. But yeah, they kind of already have an argument right away from the beginning, and it's like, oh, whoa, okay. But that's kind of like building up towards the very end, of course. They go to the really nice place Like you said, you like the conversation where Jesse talks with the two guys, right?
Yeah, he pitches what I would argue, again, Richard Linklater just happens to have this knack for pitching incredible ideas that he just refuses to follow through with, which just it pisses me off for some reason. Like they don't go see the play. And then of course in this one, Jesse pitches this book idea of a bunch of different characters, and they all go see the movie on the waterfront at a different time in their life. And they all have like these different psychological anomalies. And the only connection is they've all seen on the waterfront. And it just sounds like this amazing book that I would love to read. Someone needs to call Richard Linklater and say, hey, stop making movies. We need you to write this book because I want to read the book because it sounds great. And it's disappointing that the book doesn't exist.
I love that conversation. It's pretty good. They have a couple, conversations. I think Celine, is making dinner and they're hanging out and they have dinner, which is kind of a long scene. It's Celine and Jesse, but it's also kind of like an older couple, which is the old author and a friend of his. They're both widows, kind of like the couple that's also their age as well, who's there. And then kind of like a younger couple who is there as well. They talk about, once again, a lot of different things. They talk about life, love, and like we talked about yesterday in depth, they all kind of have their own perspectives of relationships and life and love. And they kind of like interact with each other in like a couple different ways that are interesting. And it's not my favorite part of the movie, but it's pretty good. It's still like a good part. I wouldn't say it's bad.
Yeah, I would definitely say, like, if you cut like one scene out, like this would probably be the scene you cut out, because it's basically the whole scene is just like each couple basically like says their philosophy on love, which I think it's interesting to see like the different like ideas on love. But it's like once you hear like one of them, like you get it, right? You like get the idea. And so like to go through each and every one of them, or like each and every couple, and just to do that for like 30 minutes, it feels a little like by the time you get back to Celine and Jesse, and they have like a little quarrel because of course Celine reveals that Hank wants to move back to Chicago, which is just like a perfect blow. Because like what is Jesse supposed to do at that moment? Like you can't have an argument at the table in front of like this important author person, like all of your friends. So it's just like this perfect little blow. But I do agree that the whole scene, although there are some interesting moments, this idea of love, the author believes that love is just two individual people, right? You're not one person. We're just two people living in the world, and you live in this world together, which is the way, of course, Emily and I see the world. Is we both have our lives, we both live it, and then we just happen to be together, which is incredible, and we love it, but we're not just this one thing. Or the way the young couple sees love, which is just like, hey, like we probably won't be together in 5 years or 10 years and 15 years. We might not be together, next week. That's fine. We just live in the moment. And then I don't know what the other couple's love thing is, but they all have their own little love.
Each of the actors have their own little, I guess, moments, you might say. And I think at the end, they reveal that the couple that they're his age, they got a hotel room for them to stay in that's from walking distance from the house. And they're like, no, we don't want to do. And they're like, well, we can't cancel it or get a refund. So you're going because we will be offended if you don't. They're like, okay, fine. So yeah, they have dinner, and then they have another really long conversation where they walk from the house to the hotel room. And I would say that conversation, it's in good spirits. They talk about how like, oh man, we haven't done this for a while, just like you and I, just kind of hanging out, walking around. It's been a while since we've done something like that. Like Celine asks, like, hey, if you saw me in a train right now, would you think that I was attractive? They're kind of playing with that kind of time aspect of like, what if this happened? What if that happened? Have things changed? We both gotten older, things have changed since we first met, so many years ago. And Jesse is like, is this really my life? Kind of asks like, is this really my life? I like those conversations because yeah, it is kind of weird being alive and kind of existing in time and in history. Those conversations are my favorite conversations in the whole trilogy. And they're kind of why I like those early Linklater films. They're very, very good about that. Yeah, and they just kind of have just like a long walk where they talk about a bunch of different things. Is there something I'm missing?
I don't think so. I think you hit basically the big points, the kind of idea that how one moment can change everything. And if that one moment didn't happen, would they still be together? Would their lives be, fundamentally different, or would they be the same, right? If they hadn't met that first time on the train, would they have still met 10 years later, 20 years later? And, if they didn't meet 20 years later, right? If they didn't, like if they just met a day later or a day sooner, would that same thing take place? And think Linklater's very interested in all three of these films with moments more than anything else, and how a single moment can kind of change everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, they arrive at their hotel room. They're hanging out at their hotel room. And yeah, what basically follows is just like a very difficult argument that's very kind of hard to watch.
Yeah.
Talked about this in depth yesterday, but yeah, it's just a very difficult to watch, I think.
Something that I didn't mention yesterday that I didn't realize actually until we started having this conversation today is something I found really interesting. I don't know if this is a real parallel or not, but in Before Sunrise, their romantic relationship starts right at sunset, and then the fight happens right after sunset. I just think that's a really interesting parallel, that sort of these two sides of them, right? This very romantic side of them. And then also, well, I would argue actually it's not really two sides of them. I would argue, this sort of passion really comes from the same place, like this
Yeah.
anger and that passion that's in the first film are both come from this sincere place of love. And that whole conversation in the apartment really is about love, because of course, when they first get in there, they're about to have sex. I love that moment because it feels very much like what a couple who has been together for a long time would do when they're going to have sex, which isn't like this very, I mean, not always, of course, but like, it's not this very like, sexualized, not that's not an important moment, but it's like, it's just something you do as much, it's an activity, right? As much it is, going out to dinner, or, it's not like this thing that's kind of like fetishized, and they just kind of, right, they just kind of comfortably get into it. But of course, as they're kind of moving through the motions of getting undressed, Hank calls.
Earlier in the movie, of course, Hank called Celine about leaving. He calls her again about arriving in London. And both times she doesn't give the phone to Jesse, which he's a little offended by. And that kind of jumpstarts the conversation where they talk more in depth about how, Jesse is kind of like, we should really maybe kind of try to talk about, or at least try to kind of play with the idea of possibly, moving to the United States so I can spend more time with Jesse. And of course, Celine is a little upset by that. She's like, we've built this life in Paris. I've raised these daughters, most of the time. And, there's I have this new job opportunity in the government that I really want to do. And yeah, the conversation kind of spins out from there. I think Celine, accuses Jesse of cheating. Of course, she talks about him, having to go on all these book tours and being, not home enough, and, traveling a little too much and not being there. And Celine also kind of talks about, being suicidal at one point as well. And we talked about it before, we could talk about this forever, but the way that it's filmed and the way that it's blocked, very, very well done. I would say pretty, as best as it could be. Very impressive how they're able to kind of, work with what they have in that room.
It's really intense, and the way they block it is just absolutely brilliant, especially when you're working with such a small space for so much of a film. For it to feel that dynamic, even though it is just two people in a hotel room, is very challenging, and the fact that they do that well is very impressive. And then of course, Celine leaves the the hotel room, and comes back multiple times, which is just something I love, because it's so common in the middle of an argument and just be like, I'm over it. And then you leave, and then like the moment you leave, you feel like shit. So you're like, well, now I'm a shitty person. So then you come back, or like you figure out something you want to say, and she comes back, and she does that a couple of times, and like they go back and forth, and they argue, and it's intense. Which, I mean, of course it is, because it's an answer that there really isn't. Like the conversation in the van, they're both right, which just makes the argument that much harder. Like it's not like there's a clear like this person's wrong, that person's right. I mean, of course, yesterday I talked in depth about how I agree more with Jesse than I do with Celine. He's lived in Paris for the last 10 years. It is his son. Sometimes it feels to me that, of course, you only see Hank for like 10 seconds, so how do you know? Sometimes it feels like Celine sees Hank as sort of this extra person, or, she reminds him of his old life and not her kids.
But also, I think there's also a hint of that Hank is more connected with Celine.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Though too. So I wouldn't say I take any sides. I would say I understand both positions pretty well. But yeah, I see what you mean.
I do think that is an interesting part of the film, is that Hank does seem to be pretty close to Celine, which is, I would say it's unique. I mean, of course, I'm super close with my stepdad. He sees me as his son, and so
closer than his like dad, I guess.
Than with his actual dad. Yeah. Again, I see both sides, but I still think Celine should consider moving to the U.S. I mean, I know that's like outside the realm of a film. What we should do? We should tweet Richard Linklater.
Tweet at Richard Linklater. Dude, what if you made another movie about them going to the United States and they watch around Chicago or something?
Watch that.
Watch that. Yeah, that'd be awesome. Whatever you're doing now, just stop doing it.
He's still got another, what has he got? Like 2 more years? He's got time.
2 more. Oh, yeah, I guess. Yeah.
Right? Because last one came out in 2013.
Yeah, he's good. He's got it. He can make it soon. Very, very soon. Ethan Hawke, Julie Delpy, they're both not busy. They're definitely not busy at all. What, like Ethan Hawke is like, I think he's in the new Schrader movie, right? Like, yeah, definitely not busy. I actually watched like a documentary on my Criterion Collection box set, which, by the way, to all listeners, if you like the movies, get the Blu-ray Criterion Collection box set. Great box set. Great way to own all 3 movies. And they kind of talked about that. Like the person filming like the behind the scenes documentary actually asked them, like, do you think they'll do another one? And they weren't like totally like against the idea. They were more kind of like, I don't know. They were both kind of like, well, maybe, like, I don't think they are, just because like it just feels so final. But they did kind of play with the idea of like making another movie, which was kind of funny. But I think they like making movies. So
yeah,
just kind of why they're like, I think any film project that can get off the ground is just kind of like, that's a good thing, right? Like,
I mean, I'd watch it. I guess if we can move on to after they'll tell her if you want to move on. She leaves because she basically tells him, she drops like the biggest bomb, which is, I don't love you. Yeah. Which is just, honestly, it's the worst thing you could possibly say, I think, to like another human being. Like, it's just the worst. And it hits. And she leaves. And she's sitting at like this bar or whatever. And he walks up to her and he pretends that he's never met her before.
Yeah.
And he does the thing he does at the very beginning of the first film, which is he pretends to be a time traveler. But this time he's come back and he has a letter from her 82-year-old self. And he basically reads this letter to try to convince her to resolve their issue.
Yep. And then in the letter, it kind of talks about how like, like, Celine, you should just be more this or more that. And it also, I think like he caps it off with just saying like, oh, wow, yeah, the best sex that you had was in the Southern Peloponnese or something like that. And Celine is completely just like, no, I don't care. Like you're, I don't find this funny or amusing at all. And Jesse's kind of like, he confesses her love to her and he's just kind of like, I know it's not perfect, but it is true. It is love. It for sure is, even though we're having this argument, I don't agree with the fact that, you don't love me. I think there is still love in all of it. And, I think basically, we should work it out. And, from there, Celine, she ends up playing along. They don't say sorry to each other, but they both are clear that they make up and they kind of go along with the time travel thing. And, they kind of play some jokes on each other. And then, Celine's kind of like, oh yeah, we're going to have, a great night or something like that. And yeah, and the movie just kind of like zooms out of them at the table. And that's the movie. Once again, it kind of ends on a very ambiguous note. It kind of seems like they reconcile, but I guess you're not totally sure either.
I think it is the most, I don't think accurate's the right word. Perhaps it is the most detailed look of love of the 3. I think the first film kind of has its head in the clouds when it comes to love, right? It's just very just like, oh, it's just this wonderful thing people meet and la la la. And the second one, I mean, to a lesser extent, but it's still kind of like that. I've always thought that love isn't a thing where, 2 people meet and it's just like, boom, love, there it is. Now just go spend the rest of your life with each other. I think love is sort of a daily task. And I think love is found in those arguments, right? I think that true love is found in those moments. Like it's the fact that he comes to her, right, and pitches her that time travel thing after their just awful argument. Like that's love right there. Like I don't think love is just meeting on a train and, just all doughy-eyed for each other. I think love is being able to have those arguments and coming back anyways, right? Being able to be there for someone when it feels impossible. I love that idea of love, and I think it's one of perhaps the best portrayals of love in a movie. It doesn't feel undeserved. It doesn't feel sort of cheated. It doesn't feel like this silly idea of love. It doesn't feel like this Americanized idea of love or French idea of love or any idea of love. It just feels like what love really is, at least speaking from my literally one experience of love.
Final thoughts, Austin?
Of the trilogy, this is my favorite. I do enjoy the whole trilogy. The more I consider the trilogy, the more I'm enjoying it, especially talking about the trilogy 2 days in a row. I have all the more respect for this trilogy. And the final film of the trilogy, in my opinion, is the favorite, which I guess technically the Clint Eastwood trilogy, Fistful of Dollars, something, and The Good, Bad, Ugly. That's technically a trilogy, sort of. I guess The Good, Bad, Ugly is technically the best, or I think is the best of the three. But typically the third in the trilogy is the weakest, just because like by then like the ideas of the original kind of like moved on or whatever, or like it doesn't like stay focused. But I think what this film does is you can watch any of these films by themselves and have an enjoyable experience. But what this film does well, I should say, well, all three of these films do well, is each film sort of building upon the last one. Like just like every scene is building upon the last scene, it feels like every film is building upon the last film. So when you meet them 9 years later, it does feel like it's been 9 years later, and it doesn't feel like they're rehashing anything, right? It just feels like they keep going and it just keeps building. So when you have that argument in the hotel room, it doesn't feel like an argument from an hour ago. It feels like an argument that's been going on for 27 years. It doesn't feel like the climax of a film. It feels like a climax of the entire trilogy, which I think is a really challenging thing to do. And the fact that they do it so well and it just, I think, ends on a nearly perfect note is incredible. Of course, as we talked about yesterday, though, and today, it does feel, of the three, it does feel a little bloated. It is the longest, hour and 48 minutes. That whole scene at the dinner table, I don't think you need to cut all of it, but you could probably cut like 80% of that, and I think it'd be a better film. Like if you just had like the scene in the car, maybe the scene where he pitches the new book, because that's an incredible pitch, maybe a little bit of them walking, the hotel scene, and that final scene, I think you'd have a perfect film. Like I think you could cut 30 minutes out of a film, like make it an 80-minute film, like Before Sunset, and I think it'd be a perfect film. But it's not that, so I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with an 8 out of 10 as well. It's just my least favorite of the trilogy, and it's really just because of the things that you mentioned before. I like all the themes, I like the acting, I like the conversations. Once again, the final argument is a great part, but it just doesn't strike me as much as especially the second movie. The second movie I just think is just unbelievable in its presentation and its structure. The third movie I think is a little bit all over the place with its structure, but it's still great. And yeah, you gotta give it the 8 for sure. But the whole trilogy is a 10. It's just an incredible, like I said before, like I think the trilogy is like kind of, like I said, Linklater is very interested in time, and I think that the Before trilogy is like time traveling, right? It's great to watch them, right in a row, because it's like you're traveling through time. You're in 1995, you're in 2004, you're in 2013, and that's really kind of what cinema is all about, right? It's about time traveling, and it's just so convincing that you're time traveling. It's like you're really there. I can't talk about how just great the trilogy is, and how it exemplifies really how all three movies are very simple, but they say so much.
All right, y'all. Thank you for listening. You can find me at Austinlugo12.
You can find me on Twitter at ADHarp24.
And you can find this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on YouTube and Instagram at With Nothing to Say Podcast. And thank you again for listening, guys.
Yes, thank you guys.